Today I'm out here in Texas taking a look at the lightly refreshed 2020 Sequoia. If you didn't care for the 2019 Sequoia, you're probably not going to like the 2020 model, but if you did like the 2019 and you've been looking at a Sequoia, then you're probably really going to like what Toyota has done for this model. This particular trim is the new TRD trim, so we have a slightly different front end that definitely looks more aggressive and more off-road oriented content than we find in the rest of the lineup. In addition to the tweaked grille up front, the TRD Pro also gets skid plates down there. We have full LED headlamps on all trims and then LED fog lamps down there available as well. This is still a body-on-frame SUV, so if you're looking for something that's a little bit more durable for towing or for off-road duty, that's why you might want to look at the Sequoia over something like the Toyota Highlander. But because this is a body-on-frame SUV, we don't necessarily have that much more room on the inside than we see in the Toyota Highlander. Because body-on-frame vehicles have a body where you sit in the cabin, where the cargo goes, etc. And then we have a separate frame, which is where the engine, the suspension, the wheels, all that sort of thing sits. One is sandwiched on top of the other, and that's just not as space efficient as a unibody design like we find in the Highlander. That relative space efficiency is why the Sequoia is again longer than the Highlander, 205.1 inches long in this model, but we do get 8 seats on the inside, and that's a little bit different than we find in some of the other alternatives that I suppose you could cross-shop with the Sequoia, like the Dodge Durango or the new Ford Explorer, both rear-wheel drive entries in this segment, because those will seat either 6 or 7 depending on the models that you get. And if you get a Dodge Durango, it won't have a third row in the absolute base trim, so it'll only seat 5. Out back, not too much has changed for 2020. We still have one of the unique features available in this segment, which is a rear window that rolls down into the lift gate. Separate opening glass is something that we just don't find in many crossovers or SUVs in America anymore. They just seem to have gone out of style. And if we lift the hatch, you'll notice that we have a little bit more cargo space than we find in some crossovers out there, but it's not a huge amount better. Toyota is a company that is absolutely obsessed with reliability, and that's why we see no changes under the hood for 2020. And even when the Sequoia finally gets a complete redesign at some point in the future, I suspect the changes will be evolutionary rather than revolutionary. If you want a twin-turbo V6 engine and a 10-speed automatic transmission in your next body-on-frame SUV, you'll have to look at something like the Ford Expedition. Under this hood, we still have a tried-and-true 5.7-liter V8. It produces 381 horsepower and 401 pound-feet of torque, and it's mated to a tried-and-true 6-speed automatic transmission. Now, on the downside, this 6-speed automatic transmission doesn't have the same kind of ratio spread that we find in the competitors, so overall performance and fuel economy take a hit. Fuel economy comes in at 15 miles per gallon if you get the two-wheel drive Sequoia and 14 if you choose the four-wheel drive model, which is what we're taking a look at today. Towing is, of course, one of the other reasons that you'd want to get a Sequoia over something like a Highlander. When properly equipped, this will tow up to 7,400 pounds. We have a 2-inch receiver right here and a 7- and 4-pin wiring harness connector on the model that we're driving right here. And like many traditional SUVs and trucks out there, we have an engine-driven cooling fan, which is going to give you a lot of air through the radiator when you're towing those heavy loads up hills. And it's also backed by an extra electric cooling fan up front. Front seat comfort is still relatively good for this segment, although the seat is still not as adjustable as some. We do, however, have a power extending thigh cushion in this model and a 2-way adjustable lumbar support. We also have a manual tilt telescopic steering column with a decent range of motion. Unlike some big SUVs out there, the second row seats do slide forward and backward and help you apportion the space between the rear of the vehicle and the second row a little bit more equitably. And we definitely have a decent amount of legroom in here. So if you're looking for a vehicle that could more easily accommodate rear-facing child seats than some of those smaller 3-row crossovers, this might be a good option for you. You can really see with this front seat adjusted for me at 6 feet tall how much room there is between that seat back and this second row seat. The seats are also pretty comfortable. They do offer a decent amount of recline. If I scoot that seat forward and recline it, you can see how much recline we get there. And there's also a nice softly padded armrest over here on this side. If you want to tilt and slide the seats forward, that's this pull right here on that side. As you can see back here in the third row, overall legroom is not necessarily better than some 3-row crossovers out there. My knees have about half an inch of room left with the second row seat moved all the way back. But headroom is exceptionally good back here. I have about an inch of headroom left, and these rear seats have an electric recline function in this model with a pretty decent amount of movement. I still have about an inch of headroom left in that area. Really only if I'm in one of these midpoints does headroom get limited, but my head is never actually touching the ceiling, although my hair does brush against the ceiling. Now, one thing worth noting, center seat belt does come out of the ceiling. That is not my preference, instead of coming out of this seat back right here. There's an electric power fold button for the third row seats on each side, so someone's pressing that button right there, and then this goes completely flat with the cargo area in the rear, and then will electric power all the way back up. Getting out of the third row is pretty easy. There's a little foot pedal there to tilt and slide those second row seats forward. With that out of the way, you can see that the second row seats have height adjustable shoulder belts, and we have a lot of storage back here, dual cup holders on each side of the third row. As with most of the exterior, interior changes are fairly minor, so we still have a pretty standard sized moonroof right here over the driver and front passengers' heads. Height adjustable shoulder belts for the first two rows. You can see the ones back there for the first row and barely see the ones back there for the second row. Since we're in the TRD Pro model, we do have the TRD Pro logo embroidered right there on the headrests. Unlike some of the newer entries in this segment, these seats are just heated, they are not ventilated. And as we move on over to the doors, you can definitely see the relative age of the Sequoia. Compared to a lot of the newer entries, or of course the new 2020 Toyota Highlander, we definitely find more hard plastics on the inside. There's a lot of creative storage going on here as well. We have a big storage compartment down there at the bottom of the door, and a little flip-out storage compartment right there under the window switch. The bulk of the dashboard has not been updated for 2020, so we find the same overall design that we saw before, but we do have an all-new infotainment system here. This is now running the same infotainment software that we see in the latest Toyota products. For 2020, that includes smartphone integration, as you can see right there, and we also get the latest navigation system from Toyota, basically the same that we see in the rest of the products, and the new home screen layout. Below the infotainment system, we have the controls for the tri-zone automatic climate control. A lot of knobs right here in a row. These are for the automatic climate control system, and then this one over here on the left, this is for the four-wheel drive system. It is electrically actuated in this model. The engine start-stop button is hiding over here behind the steering wheel. This is also where we find the parking sensor enable-disable button, traction control over here, and then a button to raise and lower the window that's part of the rear hatch. Below the four-wheel drive controls, we have a tow-haul mode button to lock the center differential. We find the USB interface for that infotainment system right there, and then two USB charge-only ports, a 12-volt power port over there to the right of that. And then we find the gated shifter that we see in a number of other Toyota products. Drive is all the way down there. Sport mode is over to the left. Then we toggle forward and backward for gear up and down. To the right of the shifter, we find two large cup holders and then one behind it that is just a little bit smaller, but probably still able to accept some of those larger takeout drinks. And then there's this interesting storage slot here. You can see that smartphones will definitely disappear down in that slot. You could use it to keep some of those smaller tablet computers or even larger tablet computers upright. And then that area can be covered by a little snap-in cover right there like that, so that way items won't fall into the abyss. There's also a small storage cubby right there behind the shifter. The Sequoia is a pretty wide vehicle overall. It's another reason that you might want to get this over something like a Highlander, and that's really obvious when you look at the front seats and then the width of this center console between them. This opens to reveal a pretty large storage area right there. There's a removable divider, and then if we remove that divider, there's enough room right there and rails to hang hanging file folders. The instrument cluster is one of Toyota's older designs. We have a small color LCD right there in the middle of everything, and then 6 gauges around that are analog. Moving out from there, we find basically the same steering wheel that we find in Toyota's truck line. Volume and track up-down buttons over here on the left side. Buttons that control that multifunction display over there on the right. There's a phone hang-up and pickup button on this side. Then we have the controls for the standard radar adaptive cruise control. As we see in some of Toyota's older products, the cruise control main buttons are there on a stalk that moves with the steering wheel, and then you set the distance and the lane monitoring system with those buttons right there on the steering wheel itself. It's a 4-spoke design with some minor sport grips up top, no paddles on the back. Power figures and overall suspension tune haven't changed in the mainstream trims of the Sequoia for 2020. So out on the road, this drives basically like the 2018 and 2019 model. Overall acceleration is definitely hampered by the older 6-speed automatic transmission that we find under this hood. But again, if you're interested in one of the most reliable transmissions and engines available in this segment, that's definitely going to be the Sequoia. In terms of overall driving dynamics, the Sequoia is really not that far off any of the other entries in the segment, even if we're talking about the brand new entries like the Ford Expedition. The Expedition does handle relatively well out on the road, but it's still a body-on-frame SUV, so all of these SUVs are going to drive a little bit more like a truck than something like the Toyota Highlander, which is going to drive a little bit more like a car. That is to say that the ride in the Sequoia is going to be a little bit more comfortable, definitely soaks up the bigger bumps out here on this rougher road a lot more easily than something like the 4Runner or RAV4 or Toyota Highlander. But the Sequoia doesn't exactly drive like a pickup truck either. This definitely has more weight on the rear axle, so it feels a little bit more polished, a little bit more put together than something like the Toyota Tundra when you're getting out on rougher roads like we're on here. If you're looking for a 3-row SUV that has a softer suspension tuned perfectly for those long road trips, that's exactly why you might want to look at a Sequoia. On the downside, fuel economy again has not changed for 2020, and that definitely puts the Sequoia towards the bottom end of the pack when it comes to overall fuel economy. The two most likely reasons for that are the fact that the engine and transmission have not changed in a while, so this 5.7-liter V8 may be very reliable, but it's also been around for some time. Compared to something like the Ford Expedition, you are going to get significantly better fuel economy overall in the Ford. But interestingly, at least at the moment, we don't have many off-road oriented vehicles in this particular segment. So if you're looking for something that can go a little bit further off the beaten path, then that may be a reason for you to get something like this Sequoia, because we do have the TRD Pro model that we're driving right here, and we don't have the same kind of off-road package available at the moment in most of the competition. What generally separates vehicles that are in the Sequoia's category from the average three-row crossover is the four-wheel drive system. We do have a true two-speed transfer case here, full lock of the center coupling. We also have a low ratio mode, something that we don't generally find in something along the lines of a Highlander or a Honda Pilot. But oddly enough, you will find these same features in a crossover like the Dodge Durango, which does sort of blur the lines between crossover and SUV. But this is still going to be bigger on the inside and a little bit bigger on the outside than something like that Durango. Depending on exactly what you're asking of your three-row vehicle, that could be an advantage or it could be a disadvantage, because out here on some of these trails, the Sequoia is definitely quite large. But unlike some of the competition, we do have this TRD Pro model, which is an interesting twist for 2020, and that does give us the ability to get skid plates in our Sequoia, and that's really going to improve the overall off-road ability. And then of course, depending on exactly the kind of terrain you're on, the solid rear axle in the back could have some off-roading benefits as well. For 2020, the Sequoia is going to start at $49,905. So as you can see, this is definitely a premium over your average three-row crossover in America. For that price, you're going to get two-wheel drive and the SR5 trim. If you want four-wheel drive in your Sequoia, that's going to set you back at least $53,130. The TRD Pro model that we were driving today started at $64,030, and if you're going to get the very top-end Platinum model, all-wheel drive, that's going to set you back at least $69,170. That may sound like an awful lot of cash, however, that is really in keeping with the rest of the large SUV segment in America. The Chevy Tahoe, the GMC Yukon, the Ford Expedition, etc., they're all going to be in this same relative price range. So who is the Sequoia for? Well, this is really targeted at someone that wants to tow more than you can in the average three-row crossover in America. Something like a Toyota Highlander, Honda Pilot, or a Nissan Pathfinder, you could tow up to 6,000 pounds or so in most models in that segment. This will tow over 7,000 pounds when properly equipped, and it's going to tow those weights very differently because this is a body-on-frame vehicle, so the tow experience is going to be quieter. There's more sound isolation between you and the trailer since the hitch is connected to the frame and the body is isolated from the frame somewhat. You also might want to take a look at the Sequoia if you're interested in doing more rugged off-roading, because we do have those skid plates under there, and we have a more robust four-wheel drive system than we find in the average crossover in America. And of course, lastly, if you're looking for just a smidge of extra interior room, we do find more room in the third row and a little bit more cargo room in the back than we find in some three-row crossovers. But it is worth noting that there are three-row crossovers out there that are more accommodating on the inside than the Sequoia. If you want to know how the Sequoia stacks up against the competition, then you have to wait until we can get our hands on one of these for a complete week so we can run it through our usual battery of comparisons and tests. But at the moment, if you're looking for a body-on-frame three-row crossover with excellent towing ability, a little bit of off-road ability, then the Sequoia is going to be an interesting option in this segment, but it is worth noting that the fuel economy is going to be significantly lower than many of its direct competitors. So depending on how you value overall reliability versus overall fuel economy, that is probably the question that's going to inform your choice. Let me know what you think about all that down there in the comment section below, and if you haven't already done so, be sure and subscribe. Find us over at facebook.com/AlexNautos, and I'll see you next week.